Hi, everyone. Welcome to psychedelicinvest.com. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Charley Rose. I am a writer for Psychedelic Invest, and I did our 2022 year in review. So that's what we're going to be going over today. I wrote the report. It's quite long. It's about 40 pages. So I've condensed it, and we're going to go over some highlights so you get a good idea of what happened in the psychedelic space in 2022. If you're interested in checking out the whole report and getting a lot more analysis and information, you can find that on our website. We're gonna move kind of fast. There's a lot of information I want to get through. So let's jump in. And if you have any questions, throw them in the comments and we'll get to those at the end. So overall, in 2022, growth in the psychedelic industry was very positive. Most areas saw growth, and we're already seeing that continue into 2023. 2022 was important because it's setting the foundations for the future of what psychedelics are going to be in our society. So let's take a little look at what happened. We're going to start with investment growth. So actually, this is one of the few areas where we did not see positive growth in 2022. That is not exclusive to the psychedelic industry. It was not a great year for the stock market, and all stocks in the psychedelic index went down significantly in 2022. We saw billion-dollar market caps drop to around 500 million, and all stocks took a hit. Obviously, that has to do with the greater economic climate. But what we also saw is when psychedelics first really started picking up a couple years ago, a lot of people who had personal experience with psychedelics were really excited and really interested in getting involved. And not everyone realized that it was going to take time for a lot of things to happen, and it's kind of a slow burn. And so there was a little bit of a reality check there during 2022 as we move forward. This is, like I said, really the only place in the industry where we didn't see positive growth in 2022, but it's not necessarily a reason to be concerned about the long-term success of psychedelic stocks, as it's in line with the greater economy. So funds and venture capital, we did have less money invested into psychedelic companies in 2022 than in 2021. However, there still is a significant amount of money coming into psychedelic companies, certainly more than just a few years ago. So a couple of the companies that got funding is Mycomedia Life Sciences and Gilgamesh Pharmaceuticals raised quite a bit of money. Another one I wanted to highlight is Fluence, because they got a lot of popularity with some of the psychedelic investment funds. And on that note, we had a couple investment funds focused solely on psychedelics close funding rounds. Palo Santo closed a $50 million fund, and we had Iter Investments. They passed their $20 million target in the closing of their first fund in 2022. In addition to funds that are focused solely on psychedelics, we had a lot of interest coming into psychedelics from funds that are focused on things like cannabis, biotechnology, healthcare. So that's a really good sign that psychedelics are becoming more acceptable in the greater space, and more people are interested in what it's going to be down the road. So a couple examples of that, there was a few, but we had Andrew Forrest, private holding company, Tatarang, launched a $172 million fund called 10 Mile. They're focused on biotechnology, but one of their first investments was in an MDMA company developing MDMA analogs. So that was really big. And then Phyto Partners, which is a big venture capital fund, also launched a fund focused on wellness and psychedelics. So a couple examples here, but there was a lot of money coming in from funds that weren't specifically focused on psychedelics. Media and events, big year in 2022. It certainly skyrocketed. We saw increased traffic to media publications that are focused on psychedelics. Here at Psychedelic Invest, we saw subscribership grow 75%. And Psychedelic Spotlight, another big media company in the space, hit 1 million impressions multiple months in a row. It was growing steadily throughout the year and saw a really big upturn in traffic after the release of How to Change Your Mind on Netflix, which was based on Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, that came out in 2018. So that was really great. And in addition to the media from outlets like us who are focused solely on psychedelics, we saw a lot of articles coming out from mainstream media companies on psychedelics, all really, really positive. And that's really important for reaching the people who are not necessarily already interested in psychedelics, but are just hearing about it and are kind of dipping their toes in, interested in finding treatment. So some of the big names that we saw release articles were Forbes, had quite a few. We got the New York Times, the Atlantic, Vice, and a lot more. Constantly new articles were coming out about the benefits of psychedelics. So that was really big and positive in 2022. Job growth, we saw the biggest job opportunity for therapists. There's a high demand. And actually in 2022, therapists there's a big shortage, not just in the psychedelic industry, but in general. Many therapists had super long wait lists. It was really hard for people to find someone to work with. And psychedelics take an additional skill set. So therapists that are qualified are in even shorter supply. So there's a lot of job growth there and a lot of opportunity. The other two biggest job opportunities were in research and development and jobs in ketamine clinics. And apart from, working with patients in clinic or working in a lab, most jobs are remote, which is in line with the greater employment market. Since the hit of COVID, remote work has increased exponentially, and that's certainly the case for the psychedelic industry as well. All right, we got a lot to go through here. It was a big year for research in 2022, tons of new studies and clinical trials coming out. So when I first put together this presentation, I had like 30 studies, and we would take up the entire live stream if I went through all of them. So I'm going to highlight a few and talk about why they're significant. So first, some of our top trials. First in ketamine. So these clinical trials are super important because ketamine clinics are using the drug off-label, which means it's not covered by insurance and can be very expensive, usually thousands of dollars. This prevents a lot of people from gaining access to it. So these clinical trials are important in getting ketamine for things like depression and anxiety through FDA approval, and then more people will have access because it'll be covered by insurance. One of the big trials in ketamine was by Awaken Life Sciences for alcohol use disorder. It was their phase 2 trial. Phase 3 will be commencing in 2023. This was the largest trial for ketamine-assisted therapy to date. And it was also the first phase 3 trial to gain government funding. We saw a couple other trials get some funding from governments this year or last year. And that was really big because that's the first time this is happening. And it's a good sign that, politicians and government agencies are seeing the efficacy in these drugs. We got a couple other ones highlighted here. One looking at the neuroplasticity of psychedelic treatment, which is a big development for the overall science of understanding how psychedelics work. We got another phase 2A for depression. And then another one for depression and suicide. These are just a couple highlights. In ketamine, there were tons of clinical trials testing ketamine in 2022. We got MAPS, so I'm sure you've heard the name before. They are pushing MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD through the FDA approval process. They had their phase 3 study in 2022, and we're looking at about another year before it gets FDA approved, but the results were very, very positive, and they have quite a few trials going on. These are just a couple. They're also looking at MDMA for social anxiety in autistic adults. It's in phase 2, and then we've got one for eating disorders. So they have a lot going on. Compass Pathways, another one who's at the forefront of getting a psychedelic drug passed. So they had their phase 2 trial results released at the end of 2021, psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, and they released their program design for phase 3, which will be happening likely sometime this year. All right, we're going to go through all the different indications that are being pursued in clinical trials. There's a lot of them. Like I said, I wasn't able to include examples of all the trials going on, but I have a couple points that I want to bring to you guys. So first, the drugs that are being tested, we've got MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, DMT, 5-MeO, ibogaine, obviously ketamine, and mescaline are all the psychedelics that are going through clinical trials right now. So first, we have treatment-resistant depression, major depressive disorder, and suicidal ideation. So these all fall under the umbrella of depression, but there's different specific indications that companies are going after. The one I wanted to talk about here is small pharma. You might have heard they just released their data in the last couple weeks from their phase 2A trial of DMT. The reason this is significant is they are working with a short-acting psychedelic, which there's been a lot of discussion over the past couple years whether or not these short-acting psychedelics are going to be as effective as your longer ones like psilocybin and LSD, where you're going 4 hours or over. Initial data showed it was positive, so we're just starting to get data on whether or not the hypothesis that can be as beneficial is true, and we will start to see more of that coming out as well. We've got addiction, so clinical trials are looking at smoking, alcohol, opioid, cocaine, methamphetamine, and behavioral addiction. A lot of different areas within this going through clinical trials. I wanted to highlight this phase 2 trial testing psilocybin for the treatment of alcohol use disorder. This is really big because back before psychedelics became illegal, there were quite a few trials testing psychedelics for alcohol addiction. And so we know there's some data there that shows that it's really beneficial, but those studies that were not done in a way that is accepted in our modern scientific community. And so now we're getting that data that will be more presentable to the FDA and to people who are looking to treat alcohol use disorder with psilocybin. Another one I wanted to highlight, we got a phase 2 trial for ibogaine for opioid dependence. Ibogaine has not been as studied and as common in clinical trials as some of our other drugs, but it does show real promise in treating opioid addiction, which is a major problem worldwide, especially in the US. So that was a really important one as well. We got anxiety. So MindMed had a big trial, their MM120 drug, which is a deuterated LSD compound. They're testing for the treatment of anxiety disorder, and there's some other clinical trials going on with that as well. PTSD is obviously a really big one, and there's tons of trials going on testing different psychedelics, DMT, psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine. This one that I wanted to highlight is a take-home trial. So if we're able to remove the need for a clinic and a significant amount of time with a therapist, that drops the cost of treatment significantly and helps make it more accessible. Eating disorders. This is an interesting one. So we definitely have some trials looking at things like anorexia, but on the other side of it, there are also some trials looking at binge eating disorder and other things that are associated with obesity. So we don't really have the data on this yet. However, if psychedelics can help with those issues, there is a massive market opportunity for it. There is it's either 42 or 43% of Americans are obese, and the numbers in the UK and Canada are also pretty significant. And it's a huge strain on money for insurance companies, healthcare. So if psychedelics could tap into that market, it would, one, be very profitable, and two, be helping solve a major issue. A couple other of the indications that are being targeted with clinical trials, we got Parkinson's, ALS, autism, Fragile X, which is a biomarker that's associated with autism, bipolar disorder, chronic pain, traumatic brain injuries, which has gotten psychedelics some media coverage because things like the UFC, NFL, hockey, they tend to have brain injuries after playing the sport. And so that's been a really big focus. And then also stroke recovery, there's been some studies there as well. So in addition to clinical trials, we have studies coming out of esteemed research institutions. This is really important because the clinical trials, companies are pushing a drug through the FDA pipeline to get it approved and get it out to patients. But it takes a significant amount of capital and time to do this. And so many of them don't have the money to do other trials that could be beneficial in getting more information about how psychedelics work and what they can do, what their effects are on the body. So they don't really have the time and money to look into that. And that's really beneficial for the psychedelic field. So we've got places like Johns Hopkins, Harvard, UCSF, Imperial College London, even Cambridge, all doing research on psychedelics at an increasing rate. So one of the studies, or rather a review that I wanted to touch on, this came out in the middle of 2022. It's an umbrella review of the evidence that supports the serotonin theory of depression. So what that is it's been long believed that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, and SSRIs have been marketed on that theory. And this umbrella review looked at all the evidence supporting that and found that it really wasn't substantial. And so that brings up the space for new theories and new treatments for depression, and saying, we really don't know what exactly is causing it. And so that leaves way for psychedelics to really come in and make a big impact. Another big study, Johns Hopkins found that psilocybin treatment for depression is effective for up to a year in most patients. It could potentially be beyond that, but they asked at a year, and that was the information they got. So we don't know how it holds up beyond a year. There was also an observational study on the benefits of ayahuasca. And this is an interesting one because ayahuasca is pretty popular among the psychedelic community, but it's not so big in biotech because it's a little bit harder to administer. It's not very reliable in dosing. So there's not a lot of studies going on with it, even though it has shown some promise in the indigenous community for treating a variety of conditions. I wanted to highlight the Alexander Shulgin Research Institute. So if you don't know who Alexander Shulgin is, he is known as the father of ecstasy. He was a chemist who carried out psychedelic research even after it became illegal, and he has a catalog of a ton of novel psychedelic compounds, which could be really beneficial to the psychedelic space because creating these new compounds takes a lot of time, a lot of money. And so the Research Institute, which raised $8 million back in 2021, has partnered with Camtech to carry out research on his catalog of novels, and there could potentially be something really amazing in there. And also his wife, Anne, passed this year. They were both really significant in just adding to the psychedelic industry and keeping it alive and doing research even when it became illegal. So I wanted to highlight that, pay tribute. Let's look at the regulations and politics. So our big one here, Colorado passed Prop 122 back in November of 2022. And this is the second state in the US to pass this type of legislation. They will have until November 24th to solidify the regulations for the program. What it did, it decriminalized a number of psychedelics, so psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, and ibogaine. And then it also is setting up the groundwork for psychedelic clinics to become available to patients who are over the age of 21. Something interesting about this piece of legislation compared to Oregon's, it also sets it up so in 2026, the board who is overseeing this program can decide to add DMT or mescaline or ibogaine to the psilocybin program where people have access to it in clinics. Oregon, which voted to legalize psilocybin treatment back in 2022 or 2020, finalized their regulations for Measure 109, and we're starting to see the rolling out of that here in 2023, which is great. On the federal level, Senators Cory Booker and Rand Paul introduced an act called the Right to Try Clarification Act. The really big point here is that we're starting to see bipartisan support in 2022, which has not historically been the case. Republicans were generally very against psychedelics, so it's great to see that both sides are coming out in support. Congress also announced the Psychedelic Advancing Clinical Treatments Caucus, which sounds really great. It's a little bit insignificant. They're just there to start spreading awareness about psychedelics, so it doesn't really do anything, but it's kind of showing us that they're starting to take interest in psychedelics and that they're paying attention to the people who really want access to these treatments. Up in Canada, 8 patients sued the government for the right to psilocybin therapy. Dustin talked a little bit about this on Monday, but there was another lawsuit that was for access to medical cannabis, which has a lot of similarities with this. So a lot of people in the industry are hopeful that this will help Canadians gain access to psilocybin therapy. No big regulatory changes were made in Canada. However, psychedelic shops have been opening in some of the big cities, giving people access to psychedelics. This is technically illegal, but the government hasn't really done anything about it. So that's great for people's access to these compounds. And then Thailand also announced that they would be conducting studies to test psilocybin for the treatment of depression. Just goes to show that this is starting to become a global thing. Thailand has historically had very strict drug laws, and they're starting to look at whether or not this is a viable treatment. And if the studies are positive, which they likely will be, then it will become legal in Thailand as well. A couple of the issues that we saw this year or last year getting my years confused, was kind of the fight over who owns psychedelics. So one of the big things in this was Compass Pathways. Their patent was challenged by a nonprofit called Freedom to Operate. And they were basically saying that their compound COMP360, which is synthetic psilocybin, is not a novel compound. And the patent did stand. And so this was a good sign for biotech companies who are developing synthetic versions of natural psychedelics. And there was some disagreement from a lot of people over whether or not these companies should be owning the rights to these compounds. There was a lot of work done synthesizing and creating psychedelics that happened when it was illegal. And there's some argument over whether or not some of that work is being now taken by biotech companies and patented as their own. Another issue that was talked about a lot in 2022 is how we're respecting indigenous communities who have been working with psychedelics for centuries. So one thing that we saw quite a bit of is places that are decriminalizing psychedelics, including mescaline, are excluding peyote from their decriminalization act. So peyote is a cactus that has mescaline in it. It's been used for a long time by indigenous, mainly Native American communities as a medicine, and it's becoming increasingly hard for them to find. So places like Colorado, Santa Cruz, California, they include in their decriminalization excluding peyote because they don't want to prevent future generations of these communities from having access to this medicine. There were a lot of panels and discussions about this, bringing in people from that community, getting them involved, hearing from them, but there does need to be a lot more done going forward. So these communities, they've been working with these medicines for so long and they have so much knowledge about them, and it's not in a way that the scientific community really acknowledges because they're not doing double-blind placebo-controlled trials. But to build this knowledge and these traditions, they did do a lot of trial and error over the years, and they have so much knowledge to offer us. So hopefully going forward, we'll be able to integrate the two communities together a little bit more. There was also growing interest in psychedelic retreats, which is supporting the economy in some of these rural communities that don't have a lot of money. So that is the end of it. It looks like we don't have any questions, so I'll give you guys a second. If you have anything, let me know. I'm happy to answer any questions that came up. Otherwise, we will end here. So thank you for joining me. If you're interested in learning more about some of the things we talked about, I go into a lot more detail and provide a lot more data in the report on our website, psychedelicinvest.com. So definitely go check that out. Thanks for joining me.